chest, you get the message. Thinking east and west hemispheres, then it's simply clear to affect the present. Transoceanic trade brought the good sugar religion, and you get the message. So now just kick back and relax, get some popcorn or some snacks or some textbooks, cause you know we about to spit some real facts in this unit with Simone and Doris and Mia Jaden. Thank you all for your patience. Can't keep this LAQ waiting. Yeah.
So in this screencast, we will be discussing the comparison of China and Japan in response to Western penetration by Simone Humphrey, Mia Samara, Doris Perez, and Reese Jones. In this unit of AP World History, we explored the time period of 1750 to 1900 with a focus on the comparison of China and Japan's response to Western penetration. This time period shows how these countries reacted and were impacted to the rise of the industrial age, differing by factors such as culture, conflict, and trade. These are our three big idea questions. What are some cultural effects that happened as a result of Western penetration in both China and Japan? Why was Japan more open to Western ideas than China? And why was technology a necessity? This is our thesis and our contextualization. Evidence 1. Response towards culture. To stabilize their country, Japan promoted the welfare of all people within their dominion through the establishment of the imperial house law and the constitution. These laws were set as the foundation of the government and leaders to come. In contrast, China experienced a different relationship due to factors such as war. This resulted in the Chinese to focus on self-strengthening, cutting off trade, and a number of treaties to come. Both pieces of evidence that come from JSTOR and History Hanover demonstrate why Japan and China were worried of cultures getting lost and changed due to Western penetration. China did not want to incorporate any influence of the West, but failed to do so in years to come. Their culture was influenced by the West with new knowledge that only some scholars found applicable to the survival of the country. With Japan, the Treaty of Kanagawa led them to believe they were losing control of their country and needed to westernize. This caused a shift in many areas in terms of education by the introduction of science and other topics into their studies in order to become stronger and more like other European countries. This is a picture that shows the spheres of influence within China and Japan. 2. Response through conflict. As talked about in the last evidence slide, China experienced the military force of the West early on. Opium Wars, unfair treaties, and the Boxer Rebellion all culminate China's experience, reaction, and prevention in the future. Through the Treaty of Nanjing, China hoped to put an end to the misunderstanding and consequent hostilities that had risen. Similarly, after the arrival of the American delegation in Japan in 1853, Japan was forced to open ports. Both pieces of evidence that come from the Treaty of Nanjing and JSTOR demonstrate the significant response and power displayed by both China and Japan. China did not want the West to influence them in any way. China was forced to open their ports to the Western trade by 1840 because they lost the war against Great Britain. This war was specifically surrounding the Opium War, which was the imposition of the trade of opium on China. They signed a treaty named the Nanjing Treaty, and it was the first of what the Chinese later called the unequal treaties. However, Japan did not encounter as much conflict towards other countries because they figured out quickly that they couldn't afford damages to their ports. In 1852, the American Navy ship had forced Japan to open their ports to Western trade and Western power. They did it with little conflict since Japan did want to embrace certain parts of Western ideas. Therefore, Japan and China did have different encounters to Western penetration that ended with similar results. This is the picture. 3. Response to technology and trade. The Industrial Revolution in Europe and the United States had created a wide gap between the East and the West, leaving Japan and China behind technologically and militarily. China's attempt to ban opium leads to the War of 1839, which leaves them defeated by the British. By the 19th century, the West, along with Japan, has spread influence and control throughout Asia. The pieces of evidence that I mentioned previously demonstrate the significance of new technology and its effects on both China and Japan. China, on one hand, was economically poor during the resistance of Western penetration. China was forced to open their ports to the West, who incorporated new technologies and sciences into their studies in order to dominate and to prosper in the economy. Japan quickly realized that the need of protection was a priority for their ports if they didn't want influence from other countries. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 led Japan to become as technologically advanced as any European power and develop their industrial business as well. The new technologies introduced to both Japan and China allowed for innovation, and it was a result of Western penetration. This is a comic for the Meiji Restoration. Situation in POV. Number 1. The article by Hildreth shows how Japan and China's response to Western imperialism differed. He touches on the cultural, political, and economic factors that played a significant role in how Japan versus other Asian countries viewed the emergence of the West. Japan was an easy prey for imperialism. This subordinate position was enforced upon Japan by the United States in 1854 with a treaty port system that obliged her to open her ports for foreign trade and residence. This was important for imperialism to develop because Japan was in the right condition and gave a rise to their international ambitions. Number 2. The main topic for these articles is China's response to Western culture. The first source talks about the Opium Wars in China and how China's power relationship with Japan was reversed after China lost those wars against Britain. The second source explains that the Chinese were not open to trading with the West, which led to smaller wars, the signing of unequal land treaties, and self-strengthening within China. The question was answered by both sources because both sources gave good causes and effects that would assume that China is bitter toward the United States. Both sources were secondary, and they gave background information that helped explain how China advanced over time through many factors. One weakness could be that the second source talks about both China and Japan, so less information about China was given to the general public. Our third situation and point of view. The main topic of this source explains that the Chinese were not open to trading with the West, which led to smaller wars, the signing of unequal land treaties, and the self-strengthening within China. This source also talks about the Opium Wars and the cause of them. The cause was animosity between the U.S. and China, and this was due to the U.S. wanting more open trade and China retaliating in the form of naval confrontation in November of 1839. The question was answered by this source because it gave some key causes and effects that would help one assume that China is bitter toward the United States. One weakness could be that this source talks about both China and Japan, so less information about China was given to the general public. This could be compensated by adding more specific facts or context from other sources within this bibliography. These are our 3 AP World History themes. Theme 6, Technology and Innovation. The development of technology such as weaponry and medicines were a great influence on the West's ability to impact and penetrate Japan and China. Weaponry was sought after during industrial times to be able to be caught up with where the West was. Medicine was used in both positive and negative fashion, such as the Opium Wars. Theme 2, Cultural Development and Interactions. Both China and Japan were influenced differently in regards to Western culture. Through the interactions brought by Western penetration, both societies are faced with conflict, implementation of new laws, and a burst of nationalism to strengthen their own cultural identity. In Theme 4, Economic Systems. Western penetration was rooted in expanding trade and trading partners. Trade was vital in all economic systems across the globe. Now you will have some time to think about the answers to our 3 big idea questions at the beginning of our screencast. Okay, so a possible answer to the first question was that China went through the Opium Wars against Great Britain because they did not want anything to do with Western ideals in order to keep their traditional values. Japan, however, was open to specific Western ideals like math and science so they could improve their military strength. A possible answer to the second question is that Japan was more open to the West than China because they did not want to be invaded by all Western ideas at once, so they took certain ideas in order to protect themselves. And a possible answer to the third question is that technology was a necessity because without it, advanced countries would take over underdeveloped countries easily and continue to gain more land. This is our bibliography. Any questions?